They closed on an unprotected planet. Then Earth's warships erupted through the night, and their fleet shuddered. The thermal shadow on the night side was wrong. Lyarth saw it at 3:46, and for 4 seconds he did not move. The reading on his display showed a distribution pattern that did not match open space. It matched something else, something from a training simulation he had run once, 8 years ago, that he had never expected to see in real conditions. Concealed fleet positioning. 6 signatures, maybe more, spread across 180 degrees of arc behind the planet's dark curve. He had 53 seconds. He spent 4 of them being certain. He spent the rest opening his mouth. The galactic concordance had existed for 11,000 years. Its chamber smelled of cold stone and recycled air, granite quarried from a moon that had been dead for 4 centuries, cut into columns so tall their tops disappeared into the permanent haze above the gallery lights. The temperature had been set by a committee vote in the concordance's 3rd century and had not changed since. It was the kind of cold that had nothing to do with the weather. Fleet Decider Urethsal stood at the speaker's dais. He was Sundori copper-bronze plating across his skull and upper chest, not armor but grown, the way his species grew such things after enough campaigns. His forelimbs had 7 joints each, and when he issued formal statements they locked straight at the elbow and wrist, a holdover from territorial display that his species had never bred out because it had always worked. He had run 8 campaigns. He spoke without urgency, because he had never needed urgency. "We are not requesting permission," he said. "We are filing notice of annexation under Article 7. The world is uncontested. The species that claimed it has left it without defense. This is standard procedure." The world in question was a planet called GK91 by the Survey Registry. Agricultural designation. Scattered settlements. A surface population of volunteers on 5-year land agreements, growing crops in the lowland basins. 1 military installation, 340 soldiers at a forward base near the northern plateau. No orbital weapons platform. No warship traffic in 16 months. Urethsal had filed 6 annexations before this one. All 6 had passed. He knew what the vote would be before the chamber finished counting. Elder Amara of the Valley had requested the floor 3 times during this session. She had been denied the first 2 times. The 3rd time, the chamber gave her 30 seconds. She was 380 years old. The Valley were long-lived and still framed, known in the concordance for saying less than they knew and knowing more than they said. Amara stood, looked at Urethsal across the chamber floor, and used 12 of her 30 seconds. "I would ask the Fleet Decider whether he has considered why it is undefended." The chamber did not pause. The vote ran in under 4 minutes, 74-3. Amara sat back down. Her face held the expression of someone who had been right before, been ignored before, and had stopped being surprised by either. The wrong detail was not the vote. The wrong detail was the question she asked that no one answered. Stay close. What happens in the next 11 minutes took 19 years to build. 19 days earlier, the Ellerin Ridge had gone dark. The ship was a deep space command vessel, not a warship by classification, though it carried one. It had parked behind GK91's larger moon and cut its emissions to the threshold. The Sundori Scout sensors were known to use as their floor. The crew ate cold meals to keep the thermal signature low. They ran their displays at minimum brightness. The maintenance logs were 9 years out of date because there was nothing else to read. Admiral Sira Voss had been reading them anyway. She was 51, gray-eyed, with a quality of stillness that new crew reliably mistook for inattention. It was not inattention. It was the opposite of inattention, a kind of focused quiet that had taken her 29 years in Earth Strategic Command to develop, and which she did not explain to people, because explaining it would require her to say more words than the situation called for. She had been a logistics analyst before she moved to Fleet Command. The transition had not felt like a change to her. Both jobs were about reading what wasn't there. Her field chair sat across the compartment. It was a collapsible military-issue model, third generation, with a rear leg that had been rewelded twice and a seat that had been recanvased once using fabric from a storage crate. The left armrest was worn smooth where her right hand rested during long watches. She had carried it since her third posting. It had been on 9 ships. She had never explained why she kept it. New crews stopped asking after the first week. She set down the maintenance report when Lieutenant Nair relayed the concordance vote. She looked at the chair across the compartment, the one that had been on 9 ships and had never once been the wrong place to sit and think. Then she looked at Nair. Entry formation. Lieutenant Priya Nair was 33 years old and had spent 7 years in tactical intelligence. She had been tracking Sundari scout movement for 19 days. 4 sensor passes over GK-91, each one tighter than the last, each one returning the same clean read. Agricultural settlements, scattered population, 340 soldiers at a surface base, no orbital platform. Committed formation, Admiral, not a survey pass. They've chosen the approach vector. Nair did not add, I've been watching them choose it for 19 days. She did not need to. Voss opened the secondary screen. Captain Ewan Driscoll appeared, commanding the concealed battle group, 6 warships positioned across the night side arc, eating cold rations in the dark. He had been holding position for 11 days. Hold position, Voss said. Driscoll did not reply. He had been holding. He knew what hold position meant. Commander Yale Ben David had been a logistics strategist. She had died 12 years ago, 7 years before GK-90. One was even assigned a survey number. She had never seen the planet. She had never needed to. Her insight had not been tactical. It had been behavioral. The 5 expansion doctrine civilizations that the concordance classified as low-risk neighbors all shared a single pattern. They did not move against defended targets. They looked for undefended ones. They filed notice. They moved. The procedure was clean. It was legal under the concordance charter, and it worked because no one had ever given them a target that wasn't what it looked like. Ben David's proposal was simple. Give them one. Make it real. Real settlers, real crops, real children in some of the houses. Volunteers. 5-year land agreements, signed with full knowledge of what the planet was for. The soldiers would be below the surface. The warships would be behind the moon. The program had been reviewed 3 times, approved each time, never discussed outside the relevant command chain. Sergeant Milo Adwale was 29 years old and had been below the surface of GK-91 for 127 days. He commanded the 340 soldiers in the sealed subsurface bays. They had not fired a weapon in that time. They played cards. They drank recycled water. They waited. His orders had one conditional clause. If the hold is never released, you never fire. He did not know whether the hold would be released. He prepared as though it wouldn't be. Nair had been awake for 31 hours. She had a cup of something that had been coffee when it was warm. She drank it anyway and did not mention it. On her secondary display, the Sundari fleet was crossing the last survey boundary before the orbital threshold. 22 ships in a closing pattern that was not a survey pass and had not been won for 6 hours. She watched them come with the focused calm of someone who had spent 19 days waiting for exactly this moment, and was not going to spend the 20th doing anything different. Admiral, she said, they're past the survey line. Voss looked up from the maintenance report. She set it down again. The same report she had picked up 4 times today, the same page. I see it, Voss said. Clock. 50 minutes to orbital threshold at current velocity. Voss nodded once. She did not look at the field chair. She did not look at Driscoll's screen. She looked at the sensor display and read what it told her, which was the same thing it had been telling her for 19 days. She had known what the vote would be. She had known what the fleet would do. She had known what would happen when the fleet did it. She picked up the maintenance report. She read. The open-loop Nair hadn't closed. The Sundori fleet was committed, but no one had yet said what the 50 minutes were for. The 50 minutes passed the way waiting always passed on the LRN Ridge. In silence, in increments, with nothing to mark the time except the sensor display ticking the Sundori fleet closer to the threshold. Nair tracked them. She had been tracking them for 19 days and she was not going to stop now. 4 minutes since Voss had said hold position, 12 minutes. The fleet was running a clean approach, no lateral scatter, no sensor probing, no deviation from the committed vector. They were not checking for surprises. They had filed their paperwork. They were moving in. That was the thing about the Sundori. They did not probe targets they considered settled. Probing implied doubt. Urethsal had filed 6 annexations and had never once encountered doubt after the vote. He had no reason to develop the habit. Nair finished the cold coffee. She set the cup down to her left, in the same spot she had been setting it for 11 days, the same spot where the ring stain had gone dark on the console edge. She pulled up the formation overlay and ran the numbers on exit vectors. The Sundori fleet had 4 clean paths out of the system. 3 crossed the night side arc. 1 went over the pole. She had told Driscoll about the polar vector 8 days ago. His response had been a single-word acknowledgement and then silence. She assumed he had handled it. She did not ask. At 31 minutes past the threshold clock, Voss turned a page in the maintenance report. Nair watched this and said nothing. The Admiral had a habit of reading during the approach phase of operations, not because she wasn't paying attention, but because she was, and the report gave her hands something to do while her mind did the actual work. Nair had seen it twice before. She had stopped finding it strange after the first time. "They've cleared the outer marker," Nair said. "I see it," Voss said. She did not look up. 22 minutes to orbital threshold. Below the surface of GK-91, Sergeant Adwale's watch had just turned over. The subsurface bays ran on a 6-hour cycle, 2 shifts, 3 hours of rest per rotation. Lights dimmed to 30% during off hours to keep the biological clock from drifting too far from surface time. The soldiers had been below ground long enough that the cycle felt natural now. Most of them slept when the lights dimmed. Most of them ate when the rations came. Most of them played cards in the hour between dinner and lights out, a rotating game of something that had started as standard poker and evolved, over 4 months, into a variant so complicated that new players needed an hour of instruction before they could sit down. Adwale had stopped playing 6 weeks ago. He spent the card hour reading the mission brief instead, not because he expected to find new information in it, but because rereading it gave the conditional clause fresh weight each time. If the hold is never released, you never fire. He had read that line enough times that he could see it when he closed his eyes. He did not find this reassuring, but he did find it clarifying. His job was to prepare. His job was to wait. His job was to be ready for an order that might not come, and to be ready for that outcome too, to stand down from readiness and bring 340 soldiers back to the surface having done nothing at all, and to make that feel like a success, which it would be. He was 340 people's argument that patience was a skill, not a personality trait. The lights went back up at the start of the new watch. The card game continued without him. Somewhere above, 7 meters of rock and insulated paneling above, the Sundori fleet was crossing the outer marker, and nobody on GK-91's surface was doing anything about it, because that was the point. Urethsal transmitted the annexation notice to the concordance at 3:41. Standard form, standard frequency. He had filed on this channel 6 times before, and the channel had always carried the same response back: acknowledgement, ratification note, transfer of registry. The process was clean. It was what law looked like when the law was written by the people who already had the power to enforce it. He transmitted the standard terms to GK-91 surface at 3:42. Transition timeline. population status protocols, the schedule under which the current residents would be reclassified under Sundori Agricultural Administration. He had sent versions of this document 6 times. He knew it the way you know a door you've walked through every day for a decade, by feel, without looking. He received no reply from GK-91's surface. He waited. His forelimbs did not lock. There was no formal statement being issued, no territorial display required. He simply waited. The silence from the surface was not unusual. Populations receiving annexation terms sometimes took time. Some of them were waiting for legal counsel. Some of them were in shock. Some of them had already begun complying and saw no reason to acknowledge the paperwork. Subcommander Lyerth noted, at 3:44, that the surface had not replied. He noted, at 3:45, that there was no emergency broadcast from the settlement centers, no request for concordance intervention, no distress signal on any frequency. "They know what this is," Urethsal said. "They've seen the concordance vote. They're complying." Lyerth wrote this in the log. He watched the surface sensor feed. He watched the atmospheric readings, no unusual energy signatures, no weapons activation, no launch signatures from the surface base. Everything was still. Everything matched what the survey data had said it would be. He switched to the nightside display. The thermal shadow distribution was wrong. He did not immediately understand why. He ran the reading again. The shadow on the night side of the planet was distributed in a pattern that did not match the planet's natural thermal profile. The shadow was too even, too distributed, spread across the arc in a way that suggested something other than open space behind the curve. He had seen this pattern once before, in a training exercise, 8 years ago. He pulled up the simulation file from memory. Not a real file. He didn't have it here, but the shape of it, the texture of the reading, the exact way the thermal suppression had looked when 6 ships had been running minimal emissions behind a moon in the exercise scenario. His upper jaw tightened. He had 4 seconds. He spent them being certain. He opened his mouth. On the Ellerin Ridge, Voss's comms officer relayed Urethsal's 341 filing. Voss set down the maintenance report. She did not look at the chair. She looked at Nair, who was already pulling the formation display into the center screen, already running the exit vector overlay, already doing the thing she had been doing for 19 days, which was knowing what came next before it arrived. "They filed," Nair said. "Yes," Voss said. Surface silence confirmed. No reply from GK-91 settlement centers. "Yes. Driscoll is holding." Voss looked at the mission clock. 3:43, 2 minutes since the annexation filing. The Sundori fleet was sitting at the orbital threshold in a formation that had no exit vector that didn't cross a firing solution, provided the 6 ships on the nightside arc were where Driscoll had placed them 8 days ago, at the coordinates the positioning plan had identified 3 years before GK-91 was surveyed. Provided the plan had worked. She looked at the maintenance report. She did not pick it up. The surface still hadn't replied. Nair said, "Lyerth just switched to the nightside display." Voss looked at her. "Sub-Commander, secondary tactical, he's running the thermal read twice." The silence in the Ellerin Ridge compartment was a different kind of silence from the Sundori fleet's silence. The Sundori fleet was silent because it had nothing to say. The Ellerin Ridge was silent because everything that needed to be said had been said 19 years ago, by a logistics strategist who had understood that the most dangerous kind of patience was the kind that looked like nothing at all. Nair looked at Voss. Voss looked at the clock. "He knows," Nair said quietly, not a question. "He knows," Voss said. She reached for the channel key. She did not press it yet. The 53 seconds had to run. That was the math. From the moment of knowing to the moment of anything that could be done about the knowing was 53 seconds at current fleet positions, and Driscoll's battle group needed the fleet committed to their current heading. One vector change in the next 50 seconds and the positioning became imperfect. Not wrong, just imperfect. 49 seconds. Voss put her hand on the channel key and waited. This was the part of the job that looked like nothing. This was the part that was everything. Show more. 14:27. At 3:47, Voss pressed the key. One word, Driscoll's channel only. The word was nightfall. She said it the way she would say acknowledged or confirmed, flat, specific, final. Then she closed the channel and watched the display. 6 ships came out of the dark at the same moment. Not in sequence, not in formation. Simultaneously, spread across 180 degrees of the night side arc, each one cutting from minimal emissions to full power in the same 4-second window, each one appearing on the Sundori tactical display at the same instant as 5 others. The positioning was not aggressive. It was mathematical. Every heading the Sundori fleet could burn toward had a firing solution across it. There was no clean exit. There was no vector that didn't end at a human warship. Driscoll's crew had been eating cold rations for 11 days. They executed in 4 seconds. On the Sundori flagship, Lyarth had not finished his sentence. He had opened his mouth at 3:46. He had 53 seconds. He had used 4 of them being certain and the rest opening his mouth. And now the 6 ships were on every display in the bridge and Urethsal's forelimbs, which locked straight when he issued formal commands, a holdover from territorial display that 8 campaigns had never changed, were not locking. They hung slightly bent at the 3rd joint. Urethsal did not notice this. Lyarth noticed it. He filed it away without knowing why. Later, much later, in a conversation he would never fully finish, he would understand that the bent forelimbs were the most honest thing Urethsal had done in 8 campaigns. Every other response, the orders he issued, the frequencies he opened, the formal language he reached for, those were trained. Those were habit. The forelimbs were the part of him that knew before the rest of him caught up. Formation report, Urethsal said. His voice was flat. This too was trained. 6 contacts, night side arc, Lyarth said. Human warship signatures. They've been running suppressed. We have no prior track on any of them. Exit vectors. Lyarth pulled the overlay. He looked at it for 2 seconds. All blocked. Polar route has a firing solution across it. Fleet decider, the positioning, they mapped this before we arrived. This configuration takes time to set. Days minimum. Urethsal looked at his display. He looked at the 6 contacts. He looked at the exit vectors. His forelimbs did not lock. Open the emergency channel, he said. Standard distress frequency. Lyarth opened it. No one answered. The frequency was not monitored by the concordance in this sector, which Urethsal had known when he filed his notice, because the concordance's monitoring coverage in uncontested annexation zones was a procedural courtesy, not a defense mechanism. It had never needed to be a defense mechanism. It needed to be one now. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. Driscoll ran it from the secondary screen on the LRN ridge, his voice steady, his orders short. He had trained his crew for this scenario for 8 months before the deployment and had run simulations of this exact configuration. 6 ships, 180-degree arc, compressed exit vectors enough times that the engagement felt, to the crew, less like a battle and more like the last step of a very long process. Which was what it was. Urethsal's flagship took its first impact at 3:48. Not a killing shot, a propulsion hit precise, designed to slow rather than destroy. 3 of his 4 capital ships lost propulsion by 3:52, each hit in the same system by the same targeting solution. At 3:55, 2 of the support vessels attempted a lateral break toward the polar vector. They had the right idea. They had it 4 minutes too late. The polar solution had been calculated before the fleet crossed the outer marker, and the ship covering it had been in position since the previous morning. They turned back. At 3:57, Lyarth watched them turn back and understood something he had not understood before. The humans had not positioned their ships to win the engagement. They had positioned their ships so that the engagement could not be lost. Those were different problems, solved differently, and the second one required knowing what the other side would do before they knew they were going to do it. He had 53 seconds between knowing and nothing. They had 19 years between knowing and this. At 3:58, Urethsol transmitted the cessation signal. It was a specific frequency, old, formal, recognized across every species in the concordance as the Sundori signal for the end of hostilities. His species had used it in 8 prior campaigns. He had received it twice. He had never transmitted it from his own ship. His hand moved to the panel and activated the frequency, and he did not stop to think about what he was doing because thinking about it would not have changed it. The forelimbs still weren't locking. On the Elaren Ridge, Nair heard the cessation signal at 3:58 and looked at Voss. Voss was reading the maintenance report. She had picked it up at some point during the engagement. Nair wasn't sure exactly when, because she had been watching the formation display, but at some point between 3:47 and now, Voss had picked up the 9-year-old maintenance report and continued reading it. She was on a different page than the one she'd been on before. She read at the same pace she did everything, unhurried, complete, giving each line exactly the attention it required. Nair had worked with Voss for 3 years. She still found this slightly unreasonable. Cessation signal, Nair said. I hear it, Voss said. She turned a page. Fleet Decider is in cessation. 3 capital ships without propulsion. 2 support vessels, the ones that tried the polar break, showing structural damage. Driscoll. No casualties. Minor hull stress on the ship that covered the polar vector. She said it's cosmetic. Voss nodded. She read. She turned another page. She put the report down. She looked at Nair. Then she looked at the concordance frequency indicator, the open channel, the same frequency Urethsol had used at 3:41 to file his annexation notice, still technically active because the session hadn't formally adjourned. Pull up the channel, Voss said. Nair pulled it up. Voss did not move toward the panel immediately. She reached across the console and picked up Nair's empty coffee cup. She turned it in her hand once, the way you turn something when your hands need to be doing something while your mind finishes a thought. Then she set it back down. Nair recognized this. It was the only version of restlessness she had ever seen from Voss, this single, brief handling of a nearby object once before something that mattered. She had seen it twice before in 3 years. She did not mention it. She waited. Voss looked at the channel indicator. She looked at the clock, 3:59. 17 minutes since he filed, she said. Yes, Nair said. Same channel. Yes. Below GK-91 surface, Sergeant Adwale heard the vibration of the engagement end. He had heard the beginning, a low-frequency resonance through the rock and paneling, the kind that came from orbital weapons fire rather than surface activity, recognizable if you knew what you were listening for. It had started at 3:48 and run for 11 minutes, and during those 11 minutes, his 340 soldiers had put down their cards and sat very still and listened to something they could feel but not see. Then the vibration stopped. No order came. The hold was still the hold. Adwale looked at the conditional clause in the mission brief. If the hold is never released, you never fire, and understood that the hold was not going to be released because the engagement was over and the hold was no longer the relevant question. His soldiers picked up their cards. One of them, a corporal from the eastern settlements who had been below ground longer than anyone and who had never once complained about it, looked at Adwale across the table and said, "Sir, did we win?" Adwale thought about this. "We didn't lose," he said. "That was the job." The corporal considered this. She shuffled the deck, she dealt. This was the part Lyarth could never explain. Not the engagement, the engagement was explicable. He had a military career's worth of language for engagements. Not the cessation signal, he had sent it. It was done. The language for that existed too, even if he had never used it from this side before. What he could not explain was the 53 seconds. Not the content of them, the texture of them, the specific quality of knowing something completely, with full certainty, with no doubt at all, knowing the shadow was wrong, knowing what the shadow meant, knowing what the ships behind the shadow meant, knowing there was a response required and that the response would not arrive in time, and having that knowledge be entirely, perfectly, uselessly complete. He had known. He had known in the way you know your own name or the layout of your own quarters. He had known in the 53 seconds, and the knowing had done nothing at all. He tried to explain this later, in the first of 4 formal accounts he would give. He used the word awareness. He used the word anticipation. He used technical language from the Sundori military vocabulary for the experience of recognizing a threat before the threat fully resolved. None of it was right. What it had felt like was holding something at full weight with both hands, knowing you were going to drop it, watching yourself drop it, and being unable to change anything about your hands. He stopped writing the first account halfway through and started over. At 3:59, Admiral Voss stood and opened the Concordance channel. Nair watched her. This was the move. This was the thing that had been building across 19 days and 19 years before that. The moment when preparation and patience met a single decision to speak. Voss did not rush to the panel. She walked to it the way she did everything, at the pace that matched the thing she was doing. She took her hand away from Nair's coffee cup and placed her hand on the frequency key. The channel opened. 74 species on the other end, 3 who had voted no. The entire concordance chamber still seated, still formal, still processing the cessation signal that had arrived 17 minutes after Urethsol filed notice. Voss read 19 words. She read them at the pace she would read a maintenance report, not slowly for effect, not quickly to compress, at the pace of someone reading aloud a thing that had already been decided and simply required the institutional record to reflect it. The planet is held, the Sundori claim is void, Earth stands as occupant and defender. She closed the channel. She looked at the display. Driscoll's ships showed no new damage. The Sundori fleet's cessation signal was still active. No one had moved. No one had fired again. No one had transmitted anything at all. She set down the empty coffee cup. Then she picked up the maintenance report. She turned a page. Nair did not move. She sat at her station and watched the timestamp on the concordance frequency and understood, without anyone explaining it to her, that she had just witnessed the moment when a logistics analyst had finally been proven right, 19 years after she was dead. Below GK-91's surface, Sergeant Adwale heard nothing at first. The cessation of the engagement had reached the subsurface bays through the rock and paneling, but the concordance channel was a different signal entirely. Internal, administrative, carried through the settlement communications net rather than through the planet's exterior sensors. He received the order to stand down the conditional clause at 4:03. 4 minutes after Voss closed the channel. Enough time for the order to be verified through Earth Strategic Command, encoded, transmitted through the settlement net, and recorded in the subsurface log. Stand down, bring the soldiers to surface, debrief in phases. The conditional clause had ended. The hold was released. None of his 340 soldiers had fired a weapon. They had played cards. They had drank recycled water. They had prepared for an outcome that now was no longer possible, that they would never be called and would have to leave the planet having done nothing at all. Instead, they had done everything. They had made it possible for nothing to be enough. The corporal who had asked if they unfolded her cards without finishing the hand, she said, "We're going up." Adwale said, "Yeah, you're going up." He stood, and the soldiers around the card table stood, and the soldiers in the medical bay, and the soldier in the communications room, and all 340 of them stood up to the new shift lights, and began the process of bringing 340 people back to the surface of a planet they had held without firing a shot. In the Sundori fleet, Lyarth received the Concordance recording of Voss's transmission and played it twice. Then he sat in a compartment with no propulsion and looked at his secondary display. The one that had shown him the shadow was wrong at 3:46, and opened the second of his formal accounts. He wrote, "I possessed complete and certain knowledge. The knowledge was useless. The technical term is foreknowledge without agency, and I understand the technical definition, and I believe I am describing something else entirely. What I experienced was clarity with no available action, not the clarity of misunderstanding, I was not wrong, not the clarity of miscalculation, I was not imprecise. I understood. I was certain. And the certainty led nowhere because the certainty arrived at a point where." He stopped. He deleted that sentence. He wrote, "The question is not why I could not prevent it. The question is how the human admiral positioned 6 ships in a location where, from my display, she could watch me know that she had positioned them there. The question is what she saw when she looked at that display. The question is whether knowing my knowledge, watching me know, and then executing the engagement anyway, whether that constitutes a form of answer I do not have language for." He stopped again. This was closer, but it was still not the conversation he would have, years later, with a junior officer who asked him simply what it felt like, and to whom he would say, I knew in full and completely and with total certainty, and there was nothing in the universe I could do with the knowing." That was the closest he would ever get. But he did not know that yet. He sat in the compartment with no propulsion and held the half-written account, and understood that he was going to spend years attempting to explain something that could not be explained, only experienced, and then silenced, and then attempted again in different words. Hesse of the Valley was 22 years old. She had watched the Concordance vote from the Residency Observation Gallery. She had watched 74 species ratify a decision that would take a world for the Sundori Expansion Directorate. She had watched Elder Amara sit down without expression. Then the transmission had come through on the open channel. 19 words, read at a pace that made them sound less like a declaration and more like a fact being recorded. Hesse listened to it twice, then she went to Amara's quarters. Amara was 380 years old. The Vali measured time differently than humans, not in the number of moments experienced, but in the depth of patterns that had repeated long enough to become recognizable. Amara had watched the Concordance for 290 of her years. She had made correct predictions. She had been wrong twice. She had been right in the wrong way 7 times. She had spoken and not been heard. She had not spoken and been glad. She took a long time before she answered Hesse's question, which was simply, "What did you know?" Finally she said, "The Sundori asked what the planet was worth. The humans asked what the planet was for. Those are not the same question." Hesse waited. "The first question," Amara continued, "has an answer that changes when conditions change. If the Sundori had arrived to find a defended world, they would have filed a different assessment. The worth would have been different. That is the nature of the first question. It is always negotiable." Hesse said, "And the second question?" "The second question is answered before the conditions exist. The humans decided what the planet was for 19 years before it was named. They decided what it was for, and then they made everything that followed match that decision. The Concordance voted on what the planet was worth. The Sundori filed on the answer to that question, but the humans had already answered the question underneath, the one that decided what the answer to worth actually meant." Amara paused. "The vote was 74-3. My no was one of the 3. My question was given 30 seconds. I used 12. Those 12 seconds are the only thing from that session that will still be read 20 years from now. Not because I was right very quietly, which means I was wrong in the way that matters, but because the question was the thing that made sense in hindsight. The question was the thing the listener hears and understands, that there are two different things being asked, and only one of them won. Hesse did not ask whether Amara had known before the vote that the humans would answer. She did not ask whether the Vali as a species had known. She did not ask whether Amara's no was a vote or a record. Instead she asked, "What happens now?" Amara said, "The Concordance will convene to review Article 7. They will sit for 6 hours. They will not add anything to the procedure. They will not be able to say, explicitly, that unprotected worlds are not subject to annexation under Article 7, because the law has no provision for unprotected as a category of defended. So they will add a new distinction. They will call it something careful. They will have to mean something more careful than they have ever had to mean before." She looked out the window of her quarters. Beyond it, the Concordance chambers sat in their permanent cold, their permanent committee-set temperature, their permanent procedural certainty. But the certainty had cracked, and only Amara could see that it would take 14 months to repair the crack enough to publish new rules that would not quite say what everyone now understood. "In 20 years, Amara said, someone will ask why we changed Article 7. Someone will read the record. They will find a 12-word question that was given 30 seconds, and they will understand that the article changed because a woman asked why the planet was undefended, not because she was right, because the question itself was the only durable thing that session produced." On the Ellerin Ridge, Admiral Voss set down the maintenance report. She did not look at the chair across the compartment. She did not need to. The chair was there. It had been on 9 ships. It had been through a 180-degree arc of human warships and a fleet decider's cessation signal and a concordance chamber that was beginning, slowly, to revise the meaning of procedure. The chair had held her the same way it always had, like it knew what waiting felt like, and wasn't bothered by it. She looked at Nair. Nair was still at her station. The display showed the Sundori fleet sitting at a cessation position, no propulsion on 4 of the ships, the cessation signal still active, holding on the frequency like a breath held long enough to change the color of the sky. "Driscoll," Voss asked. "No new contacts. The Sundori aren't moving, we're not moving, everyone is still." Voss nodded. She picked up the maintenance report. She read. The page she was on described the thermostat calibration in the port auxiliary systems. It was a 9-year-old document. It had survived 19 days of minimal emissions and an 11-minute engagement, and the moment when an entire galaxy's legal framework had shifted by 1 degree, the way light bends when it passes through something it did not expect to be there. She turned a page. Nair watched this. She had been awake for 42 hours now. She had been tracking a fleet for 19 days. She had watched 6 ships emerge from the dark. She had heard the Admiral read 19 words at the pace of someone reading a thing that had already been decided. She understood that this was how Voss rested, not by stopping, but by returning to the thing that had never stopped. The maintenance report, the chair, the page, the next page. Nair closed her station down to monitoring only. She would not sleep yet, but she could wait now. Waiting was something she had learned. Outside the Ellerin Ridge, behind the moon of GK-91, the human battle group held position. The Sundori fleet held position. The Concordance was beginning, very slowly, to understand that the annexation they had voted to permit had already become something else. Not a failed annexation, not a defeated fleet decider, not a victory in the way that word usually meant. Instead, a question. A 12-word question given 30 seconds. A question that had been right in the wrong way, which meant it would be right in the way that lasted. She picked up the maintenance report. The chair held her the same way it always had.